mic on कर लो।
A very good afternoon to each and every one of you. Myself, Dr. Radhika Bansal, on behalf of the IPEM group of institutions, I welcome all the participants from different parts of the country as well as different parts of the globe on this particular international webinar series under the aegis of IQAC cell. The track of the webinar is Pedagogical Innovations, and the topic we are going to discuss today, that is STEM education. The present webinar has organized by Center for Teacher Education. This webinar series is a part of promotion of International E-Conference, which is going to be held on 25th March 2022, titled Innovative Trends in Teaching, Learning and Assessment. The details of the conference are on the screen, and at the last of the session, it will be mentioned in the chat box too. IPEM group of institutions was established by renowned academician Dr. B.S. Goyal in the year 1996. It is successfully working in academic industry from the last 26 years. IPEM has also been awarded with so many awards. It is running many courses such as BBA, MBA, BCA, MCA, BCom, LLB, and so on. Moreover, Center for Teacher Education, CTE, department was established in 2002. Now, in present, it is successfully running with 200 intakes in B.Ed and 50 intakes in DLEd, that is Diploma in Elementary Education. Without taking so much time, I would like to introduce our resource person, Professor Linda Hobbs, Associate Professor of Education, Deakin University, Waurn campus, Geelong, Australia. Professor Linda Hobbs has designed, implemented, and evaluated professional learning for school teachers for over 10 years. She currently leads the evaluation of the Victorian Tech Schools Initiative. She also convenes Deakin's biannual STEM Education Conference. Her research work out of field, teaching in mathematics, science, teacher, and school change materials developed as part of her STEM professional learning program have been applied to a range of contexts and other programs for primary and secondary school teachers. Kindly switch on your video for taking screenshots. Form link will be mentioned in the chat box in the last. Kindly fill it. Now I give rest to my words and hand over to Professor Linda Hobbs. Ma'am, please join the session.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. Okay, so I shall share my screen now. Can you see my presentation there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so I'm aware that we've started a little bit later. I'm not sure, do I continue with my normal time or should I make it shorter?
Start, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for inviting me today to talk about STEM education. This is something that I've been passionate about for some time. I have done quite a lot of work in terms of teacher professional development, as was mentioned, both for primary teachers and secondary teachers. And some of that work we've published, some of that work we've used in our teaching. And we do find that it's quite a productive area for the teachers in Australia. So what I'd just like to show you where I am. So on the right there, there's a picture of Australia. I'm down in the south east, and there's Geelong down the bottom. What I'd like to cover today is to look at why do we even need to move towards STEM? It's not a traditional part of the school curriculum. So why this move to STEM? Then think about how do we frame STEM? So what is it actually? What approaches to STEM are being used in schools? Looking at STEM teaching and learning and planning for STEM learning as well, introducing that. And then finally finishing with some of the things that we've learned so far about implementing STEM well. So a lot of the ideas I'll be bringing to this will be obviously from the Australian context, whereas I am aware that, STEM is occurring all around the world. So just thinking around why STEM's become such a strong push or agenda around the world. STEM is a unifying concept in that it brings together the need within industry to have a workforce that has the skills needed for the future. So that's often part of the promotion of STEM. Education providers have moved into this space. We have government policy that now looks at not just STEM within industry, but also STEM within schools and what schools need to do to be able to support this push. It's tied to the notion of economic growth, and it's certainly tied to international competition between not just competitive advantages associated with innovation, but also in relation to schools or education across nations competing, particularly through PISA and TIMSS and those global tests. And then we have a more citizen-based drive where we need active citizenship within this up-and-coming technological society. So the promise of STEM is that it provides that foundation for developing those skills and technologies leading to business innovation. And of course, this delivers high valued processes and products in ways that are nimble and competitive. So it's a very neoliberal language that's often associated with STEM that's coming into schools. And there was an analysis done by Kathy Jordan looking at policy analysis documents, policy documents in Australia. And these were some representations that were associated with that. The notion of national enterprise, that it's important for sustaining economic growth, maintaining prosperity, not wanting to be left behind. So that comes out in that international competitiveness, securing a workforce, but also number 6 there, that it's actually declining and therefore the need to have more people come into STEM. So the challenge then for educators is to translate this relatively political agenda into productive curriculum and meaningful learning experiences in schools. So the question for us as educators is, how do we make it sustainable? How do we make it meaningful for students? Instead of a set of disconnected STEM activities, which often you do find in schools, that with this push, it may fade with time due to what some people called STEM fatigue, just because we talk about it so much and then they move on to another educational agenda. So just foregrounding some key issues then, or questions for educational practice and research. So undoubtedly, certainly in Australia and other parts of the world, governments and schools are making important curriculum and staffing decisions in relation to this pressure to engage with STEM ed. So this might be new teachers that are labelled as STEM specialists, particularly in primary schools, where in Australia we don't have, we have a more generalist teacher in the primary setting. There are new subjects coming into schools called STEM, which is really interesting. So in order to think about that as a backdrop, what is STEM education? What STEM practices can be translated into curriculum, but also who's counted as STEM teachers and practitioners? I've in my STEM professional development, I'll sometimes hear from teachers, I'm a biology teacher, so I don't actually see myself as a STEM teacher. So who actually counts in that sort of setting? So in terms of enacting then, what does effective STEM teaching look like? What pedagogies are needed? But also, how do we raise participation in STEM? For example, for underrepresented people in Australia, that's a lot of women. I know that I believe you don't have that issue in India, I believe. And what are the implications for teachers across the whole education spectrum? So what should it look like in early childhood, primary and secondary? And then you've got the issues of school change. So if STEM isn't part of the actual curriculum, then how do you get teachers to come on board? And one of the things about Australia is that STEM isn't actually part of the formal curriculum. It's our curriculum, the Australian curriculum, and then how that's translated into the various states and territories is that it's still very traditional, silo-based. So while there is a push to introduce STEM, it's not directly linked to the curriculum except through the various disciplines, science, technology and maths. We don't teach engineering. But we do have curriculum advice that teachers can get from both the state level the curriculum authorities as well as the national level. So then what cooperative approaches to teacher learning can be used to improve practice? So whenever you introduce a new part of the curriculum, then of course you have to, teachers need to learn about it. What does it look like? How can we learn together? And how can schools be supported in providing quality STEM learning experiences? So who's responsible for supporting that school and teacher change? Who are the key players? And then the last one is what evidence counts in evaluating STEM programs actually? I mean, if you're going to introduce something, then obviously that you're going to need evidence to show that it actually works. So I did a bit of a search and I found this article that was comparing Australian and Indian STEM education policies. And I thought it was very interesting. Maybe the authors are here, maybe they're not. I'm not, forgive me if you are here and I've misunderstood, but this is just part of what they've indicated, that Australia, when you look at Australia and India, Australia has an issue with engaging students, but in India was looking to Australia for some of our curriculum or pedagogical frameworks, which I thought was interesting. What I've noticed with the way people talk about STEM, actually, we don't have a problem with students engaging with STEM. We have a problem with students engaging with science and potentially with technology and with maths. So herein lies the need to actually define what you're talking about. And unfortunately, the word STEM has come to mean many different things. In terms of policy in Australia, this is an important document for us, National STEM School Education Strategy. They've proposed a number of areas for action for students, for teachers, for helping schools, but also to facilitate effective partnerships with industry, businesses, through their programming. And then there you see number 5, building a strong evidence base. So how can we do that? The other thing that I think has become obvious over the last few years is a strong push for by quite large conferences that you have to pay a lot of money for. Haven't seen it so much in the last year or so because of the situation internationally, but there has been quite a lot of business associated with this STEM agenda. So it's captured quite a lot of people as part of this forward-looking push. So now let's have a look at this issue of framing STEM. So how can we look at it? One of the frameworks that we've used is using this STEM vision framework, and you can use this for yourself or for a team of teachers or for a whole school. We developed this for our professional development program, and you may have seen that in that chapter of mine, the reference down the bottom there, all the references at the end of the PowerPoint. So these are 5 areas that we found were really important as part of supporting teachers to think about what STEM is and then how to implement it productively in schools. I'm sorry, that's my dog. I hope you can't hear it. So the first of these is to frame STEM. So how will you frame it for your school? And we needed to recognise this because within the 10 schools that we had working with us, they all thought about STEM quite differently, and they were there for different reasons. So I'll talk about that in a minute. In addition to that, you can look at the STEM practices and pedagogies that are needed. You could look at how the curriculum can be planned and how people can work together. Then you can think about the learning that's needed, and then you can look at how they might use community or industry-based contexts as part of your teaching, or even engage with industry as part of a program in schools. So this is how we framed STEM for those teachers, and this is how I think about it and what I've observed both across primary and secondary schools. Basically, what can it be, for whom and for what purpose? So schools often engage with STEM teaching for different reasons. Some do it to engage the disengaged, some do it to extend the advanced students, and others do it to make it more relevant to their context. Lots of different reasons that schools actually engage with STEM. So here we have 3 different models of STEM. The left, the holistic model, which recognises that anything we do, there's the 4 circles, each representing each part of STEM, whether it's individual, interdisciplinary, offerings at school could be considered STEM. So what they do in the science class, maths class, technology class, whether it's interdisciplinary or not. And then you have the interconnected model. And I think that as a STEM education community, we're perhaps moving towards this in the academic field anyway, that STEM needs to be interdisciplinary. You need to have at least 2 of the STEM areas for it to be considered STEM. And then you have the amalgamated model that recognises that actually it's the way of learning that makes it STEM, sort of the meta-discipline. And Vasquez describes STEM not as a curriculum, but an approach to learning that emphasises a real world, it's rigorous, and it's relevant for students. So just extending those ideas of Vasquez, she states it's not another ingredient in the lesson soup, recognizing that often the curriculum is already quite full, but a recipe for helping learners apply their knowledge, work together with their peers, and see the relevance in what they're learning. So again, that notion of relevance. If we are thinking about STEM as interdisciplinary, then what do we actually mean by that? Vasquez proposed 4 areas, and other authors talk about this too. So it's quite well understood, I think. You've got your disciplinary, which is students learn concepts and skills within a discipline. Then you have multidisciplinary, but you're bringing ideas together through a common theme. Then you have interdisciplinary, where the ideas actually work together and integrate. And then you have your transdisciplinary, which is getting back to that amalgamated model, which is looking that it's a real world problem-based projects. It's focusing on certain knowledges and skills rather than focusing explicitly on learning individual disciplinary knowledge. So thinking then around what approaches to STEM in schools, and obviously it depends on which of those versions of STEM you're interested in. And so what we've noticed is that there are different ways of implementing STEM. And this is actually what's happening in schools. So some schools do it to promote maths and science in response to a downturn in student interest. So that's what was referred to in that earlier paper that was comparing maths and science, India and Australia. Others do it promote science with an emphasis on engineering design and technology design. And these might be experiences in new subjects called STEM or within existing science and maths classes, or it might be through the technology classes. So the focus is on design, and a lot of schools will actually have that as their STEM focus. Others we will call STEM digital technology, and there'll be the focus on computational thinking, new technologies, robotics, coding, those sort of things. And in fact, in Victoria, there is a new area of curriculum that's come in recently called digital technology, and there had been a government push for coding. So that's often introduction of those new ideas is what some schools are calling STEM. And then we have use of real world problem solving as the context for learning. And for some, that means also linking to local industry-based problems. And we've run a number of projects or programs that are focusing on that. But for some teachers, this is what it's all about. It's a way of thinking. It's not about the robotics. It's not about the way of thinking fits in with that design sometimes. And then for others, it's focusing on STEM skills or 21st century skills. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those skills later. And often these are linked to the world of professional work or work after school. And so some of those, just with that last point, some schools will actually introduce it to help the vocational preparation of students, particularly where vocational ed is the focus of many students in their schools. And then there's an approach that's maybe more recognised around the world, which is integration of traditional classes or development of new STEM classes, where it's basically a new subject or new ideas. It could be a new club. So some schools have STEM clubs, or extracurricular activities. Yeah. So here's some examples of STEM type activities that students have produced during some programs that we've done. These were done by primary school students, actually, through a STEM and entrepreneurship in primary schools program. So in that program, we also brought in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking. But what you'll see here is your classic catapult as a STEM activity, so emphasising the design, arcade games actually introduces, at that school, they actually had STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, arts and maths, and that's quite a common thing occurring in schools, particularly girls' schools. They talk about STEAM. You got your classic separation techniques. So these activities are new for these primary schools. So you've got your pure science activities, then you've got your design theme park, you've got your bioplastics, which are sort of forward thinking, dealing with real world problems of dealing with plastic wastes. And then you've got your augmented reality, which is your obvious sort of digital technology approach to STEM. So as you can see, even just with on this slide, there's very different ways of thinking around STEM. So now let's have a look at some ideas around teaching and learning. This is part of a framework that we developed where we were wanting to push the teachers to think quite differently around their curriculum. So the idea of take it further in the middle is recognising that when you're introducing a new part of the curriculum, particularly STEM, you don't want to say this is something new. You want to say, start with what you've already got and take it further. How can you STEMify it? So with the problem context from community and industry, you can be thinking about that at different levels of child, local and global. So what problems can arise? For teaching and learning, there's different skill sets, also different pedagogies and approaches to STEM. So you may see those as one or two of those as more relevant for you, depends what's being emphasised, I guess. Certainly linking in with inquiry, design-based, particularly such a focus. And then with the curriculum, you can be looking at it in terms of how you're going to integrate the STEM subjects, if that's what you're doing, but also how you're thinking about innovation. So I'm going to speak to a few of those ideas. So coming back to that idea of problem context, what can you identify from the following communities? What we've found is that younger students can focus easier on the me and my family. So what issues can they deal with? What problems can arise? You can start looking at local communities in terms of local industries or local businesses, maybe social issues that they're dealing with. And I'll show you some examples of how some students have used STEM to focus on social issues. And then also what's happening at schools. Schools actually produce some nice problem-based, some nice problems that students want to solve, even if it's just thinking about, how you can, I need to go back. How you can create a playground that's inclusive of students with disabilities, for example. Then you've got your global issues, and I mean, they're becoming quite common and popular now as context for STEM learning. This slide talks about the STEM skills and processes. There's quite a few listed there. The ones in the middle called STEM skills, they were the ones that came from the program where we worked with teachers. So that's that second reference, that chapter. Those skills arose out of looking across the science, maths and technology, and what were the skills that were relevant. And then on the left, you've got those 21st century skills, which you've got your 4 C's there: creativity, critical thinking, communication and collaboration, which schools often pick up on. And then you have your life and career type skills. And some schools will tap into those if they're dealing with your students who are not as engaged, then that might be more of a focus for them, helping them develop flexibility and adaptability. Also, some high-level students can struggle to be adaptable in their learning. And then you've got your entrepreneurial thinking skills on the right. And what you'll find is that there's quite a lot of overlap between those. So these ones here are ones that we particularly push through our work in STEM education: the notion of creativity, which I'll talk more about, problem solving, collaboration, and that last one, taking initiative, which comes to an idea of handing the learning over to the students, which also is really common with STEM. The next thing that I think is really becoming quite aligned to the STEM agenda is the notion of design and the design process. Now, this can be represented in many different ways. These are just two. On the right is what we use in our current program, Girls as Leaders in STEM. And on the left, that's one that we've often used in our SEPS program. But as teachers implement this in their general classrooms, through whether it's a science class or a maths class, where students have some choice over what problem they're doing and then doing that background research. One of the challenges for teachers is to actually start relinquishing control over the learning. And the quote down there is from a teacher who had learnt that they need to learn to trust their students. So I have trust in them as people, that they're going to take some ownership of their learning. Yeah. In terms of innovation, these ideas come from Coral Campbell, one of my colleagues. I think it's useful to think about creativity not just as being creative and innovation not just as something new, but actually when they come together, for some reason it keeps, when they come together, you can think about it in terms of just general refinement of something that's already existing. You can think of reinvention, where you're adding new features. You can think about it as evolution of ideas, where what you're producing is changing an existing product in substantial ways. But then you've got revolution of new ideas, something that is entirely new that someone's never thought about. So we incorporate these ideas. We try to encourage teachers to think about these as they're planning STEM activities and encouraging their students to think creatively about something. And I've included this one because it's actually a great example of everything that I've just talked about. I don't know if you've seen biomimicry, but this is an area of science where they get their inspiration from nature to create new things. And just that creative act of looking at something and imagining it as something else is very exciting. So I do this activity with my students, my Bachelor of Education students, and get them to think about, what are some features of some organisms, and how could those features inspire you to come up with something new. So looking then for planning for STEM learning, I've sort of talked about some of the principles around it, but what can it actually look like? In the first instance, let's look at how you might actually bring the different STEM areas together. This was a framework that was inspired by Deakin. You'll see the reference for that in that book, that book chapter. But the first goes back to that idea of teaching the disciplines separately. And what we found that you can, in science classes, you can have a renewed focus on representations to enhance concept development. There's some creativity involved in that. And then in mathematics, teachers could use complex problem solving to challenge their students. So these were the two different approaches that we saw in the teachers that we were working with. Another way of thinking about it is teach all four, but have a more emphasis on one or two. You could integrate one into the other three being taught separately, and that one means you'd be looking at how you can introduce the idea of teamwork, investigate a problem, a solution, testing, evaluation, etc., into science and maths, but you're not actually making links between science and maths. So there's a common idea of engineering or design, and it's just happening independently in the other subject areas. I often see that in schools. Harder, though, I think, is integration of all by one teacher. So a science teacher integrating technology, engineering and maths into their science classes. And then the last one is dividing a STEM curriculum into separate subjects, where you might have a common problem that part of it is taught within your math, science, technology classes. So you have one theme that it requires teaching across them. And I'm going to show you an example of that one. So here we have a range of projects that were done by teachers. You've got your the type of the way the various subjects were brought in on the left, and then on the right, the actual activity that they did. And probably the first thing to notice is that there's some coding, there's representations, and there's design challenges. So a few different things happening there. And then you can look at how they've actually arranged the subjects. And I've used those labels that I just showed. So number D there is an example of where you've got your different subjects all working together on the same challenge. And for this one, it was designing a vehicle that they can roll down a ramp. Some of the others there to point out is probably the other one. The one at the top was just a focus on skill building. So in a technology class, introducing coding. So that was how they were seeing STEM, as part of a new technology class. C was focusing on using those representations. And then B college there was looking at bringing Lego programming into both the science and maths classes, but they weren't related. So there's some examples of how those different labels can be integrated into your classes. And so I will be looking a little bit more at D college. The next thing that I'd like to focus on is a little bit complex, but I think it's quite valuable. It's a valuable framework, and the reference is down there. Looking at, so STEM is not just about choosing which subjects or which knowledges you bring in, but it's also about how you actually bring them into the learning sequence over time. So here we have, you know, the 4 different areas of STEM. The representation is that they're intermingled in an interdisciplinary learning. So the planning and thinking occurs at 3 levels. At the macro level, you're thinking around what areas of the curriculum do you want to bring together in terms of a long-term developmental trajectory. At the meso level, you're looking at what's happening, how you actually organize the learning over time. And at the micro level, it's the cut and thrust of the classroom. It's the minute by hour type of decisions that a teacher's making about how they bring the different subjects together or the different knowledges together. So I'm going to demonstrate those 3 areas because I think it's quite useful to think about it that way. So planning at a macro time scale, basically the questions you need to ask are what subject knowledge and practices are going to be developed in the unit, and how can I ensure that these ideas and practices are going to be developed over time. On the right there is an example of ideas that came from a primary school called The Patch in Melbourne. So if you clicked into that website, you'd find a huge amount of information around STEM. So obviously they are branding themselves as having a strong STEM program. Not all schools will do that, but this school's particularly strong. And so they have their level of thinking is laid out quite neatly on that site. And these are questions that they've asked themselves, and you can see they're thinking around how they can bring in the various knowledges in the number 3, as well as those more general ideas around knowledge and skills down the bottom. What you'll find also is with the curriculum advice on STEM from both the Victorian and Australian curriculum authorities is the same sort of thing. So on the bottom right there, bottom left, sorry, This is part of the advice that they provide. So this is an integrated unit. They're emphasising science and technology in this unit, integration of content related to energy transformation with choice of materials. So what they're providing there is the general areas of the curriculum, some content descriptions and ideas of how you might actually bring those together into a unit. So that's an example of your macro. Now, coming back to College D, that design challenge that I said I was going to speak to, what they did was investigate, design and create a vehicle that would travel furthest down a ramp. That was a challenge. But what they hoped to do with that was to expose students to industrial processes and problem solving. So here it was not just about the knowledges, it was also the local industries. They actually really wanted to emphasize that. Stimulating an understanding of STEM and the career opportunities, so dealing with seeing the relevance of school through that. And then allowing students to make connections between the subjects. So they were wanting to go in and have students see that learning cut across multiple subjects and how they related to each other. So the next is planning at the meso timescale. And this comes to the idea of, this is a quote that came from a project that was published by someone else actually. I don't remember anything from weeks ago because it wasn't important to me back then. I didn't realize that I needed it for our project. So recognizing that within a learning sequence, students will experience lots of different activities, but unless they are told what they need to bring along with them, then they won't see that it's important and they won't remember. So the questions to think about are, how will the subject ideas and practices be spaced out across the learning activity or learning sequences? And how will you support the students to record ideas and recall them in the future as needed? And an example of that, if we go back to College D, this is the builder a vehicle challenge. Here you can see how they actually plan for the science and maths and technology over time. They did, in the second iteration of this activity, they actually brought in the art class as well. But here you can see it was over 6 weeks. There were excursions in there. There was an emphasis in science on friction and force. In maths, they were looking at circles for the wheels, speed and distance, etc. And in technology, they were focusing on the design process rather than technology. And in art, they were focusing on the aesthetic of the document. And one of the quotes from the teachers was, by teaching the components of the project in different subjects as a combined project, it flagged to the students that there were connections between these STEM subjects and that they were seeing that it related to the working practice in engineering. So then looking at a micro time scale, I don't go back to College D with this, but here's some research by Lira and Schauble, where they were looking at year 3 students growing plants and how the thinking changed over time and how the project actually progressed. So the questions to raise here are what questions arise for students during a task and what ideas are needed to answer those questions. So this is emergent. It's not all planned by a teacher. It's actually going with the flow. What ideas from previous learning experiences are they remembering and putting to work in the current activity? And what else does the student need to know and be able to solve the problem? So in terms of what they did in this project, they looked at why does the growth rate change? And that led to questions around, does the root growth change as well? And then to the question of how does root growth change? So there was purpose to the student learning because they were the ones asking the questions. So that's a bit of learning at the different levels. So I'm on to the last section here. So what have we learned about implementing STEM in schools through this? One of the things I wrote about in this chapter was some principles for STEM education. It needs to happen throughout the life of a student, right into initial teacher education, into tertiary education, catering for the full education spectrum there. It needs to be deliberate, explicit, and practiced. So often what we will find is that students won't know that they're doing STEM. So it's important, and actually in primary school, often students don't know they're doing science as well. Represent STEM in its multiple forms. I think if you have a look, think about those holistic, interconnected, and amalgamated model, thinking around how to represent STEM in those different ways. Enable through collaboration between groups, and that's of teachers. And then document, share, and communicate. In Australia, teachers are not necessarily good at documenting what they do to the fine detail, maybe at the macro level, certainly less at the meso, and definitely at the micro level is difficult to document. So what do teachers learn when teaching STEM? These are some things that we've found in our research. That notion of relinquishing control. When teachers move towards those problem-based and design-based learning, they actually need to hand the learning over to the students. So letting go of the reins, learning alongside students. Feedback from students was important in order to see what's useful. And remember, teachers are learning here. So it actually can be quite empowering for teachers to learn from their students' feedback. The next is rethinking practice. So when you encounter something new, obviously you need to think around how you might use that and implement that. Creativity was something that they felt that they really needed to initiate change. And the last one, depending on how you set it up, if it's just happening within science classes, how can you recruit other science teachers to it? But if you're looking at interdisciplinary approaches, then how do you get all the teachers to come together? So just a few ideas there. And then a few, some other key learnings then more generally. And I've got some images here from girls that were participating in our GALS program, Girls as Leaders in STEM. And that one there is dealing with a social issue there, dealing with cyberbullying. There's just a few that I'll bring up as I'm attending to these points on the right. So the STEM agenda, there's certainly a tension there between the promise of STEM and school constraints. It can be really hard to do something new. But as a result, we've got different models of STEM coming because schools are implementing it in different ways, despite there being that curriculum advice. Making STEM sustainable is more than adding some STEM activities into already created curriculum. It just won't work. Integration of the disciplines is just one approach. How can other discipline areas be brought in? Need to define STEM. You need to be explicit. You can't just say STEM and actually mean science. And then STEM learning is needed at all of those, or planning, sorry, STEM planning is needed at those three levels. And just that final point there around teachers relinquishing control as their teaching becomes more student-led. I won't go into these benefits and challenges, but you can probably find these from different sources. This is from STEM Connections project, that one was very much built on the idea of bringing in industry and making links with industry through your STEM programs. Okay, so that's it. There may be some questions. I'm happy to answer questions if there's still time.
If anyone wants to ask you anything about the STEM education, please feel free to ask. Okay, so move on. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very informative and knowledge-giving session. The points you discussed about STEM education, like what is STEM, how is it useful in Indian educational setting, how to teach and learn STEM education, how to design STEM skills, planning for STEM learning, conduction of STEM in the classroom, curriculum framework for STEM, and so on. I hope all the participants, whether they are students, researchers, academicians, educators, and teachers, can apply STEM education skills and methods in their teaching and in research fields. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Nishi Sharma, our principal, to propose vote of thanks.
Good afternoon to all. Thank you so much. And on behalf of IPM Group of Institution, I would like to thank Professor Linda Hobb for giving such an informative topic in this newly emerged STEM education. And it is really a very elaborative and informative session. And I'm going through the chat box, and the people are very appreciating, and they want recording and the PPTs of this session. So I would like to inform that we will share a YouTube link to you all so that you can view the session if you feel after the event also. So this is really a very good session to all of us. And IPM regularly conduct various seminars and workshops on regular basis. And in continuation of this is our second international webinar series for promoting our international e-conference on innovative trends in teaching, learning and assessment, which is going to be held on 25th March 2022. The link regarding this international conference will be shared in the chat box. So you can check it from there. The link for the Telegram group, WhatsApp group, all will be provided in the chat box. So thus the people who want to join this international conference can give their research paper, and IPM will provide different platform for publishing the papers like Scopus journals, UGC care listed journals, peer-reviewed IPM journal, and a book of with ISBN number having proceedings of the conference. So the brief description of the international conference is on the screen. You can view the details about the international conference on the screen. So I would like to request all the participants that you can join our international conference by contributing research papers on the tracks which are mentioned on the slides. And you can join the Telegram group. The link will be shared to you in the chat box. And I would like to thank all the participants who joined from different countries and the various states of India. Thank you so much for joining. And thanks to Professor Linda for joining this session in this odd hours at Australia, although it is evening in India, but I know that it is early morning there. So thank you so much. And thanks to the coordinator of the webinar, Viditi Rastogi, and all the other faculty members who are behind this event and making this successful. Thank you so much, and let's hope that we will meet in the forthcoming event, that is our international conference on 25th March. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining once again. Thank you. Dear all, you can now leave the meeting, and thanks for joining. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.